One of the questions people really want to know is, what does it mean to be saved? What must I do in order to actually be a legitimate follower of Jesus? And throughout history, there have been debates back and forth of what that looks like or how we define that. And one of the longest debates on what salvation is and how we know we are saved is that between the Apostle Paul and James. Now, I say it was a debate. It's an apparent debate that many try to stir up and see what one says versus what the other says and how that applies to us. Because there are marks of followers of Jesus. If you follow Jesus, there's something that should be evident in your life from what Jesus has done for you. And so James gets into that, and he emphasizes the fact that there needs to be something that people can see is different about you in order to actually have legitimate faith. And so we come to James chapter 2, and we start in verse 14, as James enters into this conversation, and many of you are probably familiar with it, as it talks about the works or deeds or actions that followers of Jesus are to exhibit. So we come to James chapter 2, starting verse 14, and he says, "What good is it if you have faith, but don't show it by your actions? Suppose you encounter someone who has no food and no clothes, and you say to them, 'Goodbye, have a good day, stay warm and well fed.' What good does that do?" He says, faith by itself isn't enough. Unless it produces actions and good deeds, it is dead and useless. Now, some people may argue that some people have faith and others have actions and deeds. But I say, how can you show me your faith without good deeds? I will show you my faith by my good deeds. You say you have faith, for you believe that there is one God. And I sense some sarcasm in James' voice here. He says, good for you. Even the demons believe that and tremble with terror. How foolish. Can't you see that faith without good deeds is useless? James is pretty poignant there, and most of his letter is straightforward, doesn't hold much back, and is right at you. So what does it mean to be saved? How do we know that we are saved by Jesus Christ? Well, many times throughout the New Testament, it gives us insight to this. In John chapter 3, verse 16, Jesus says, "For this is how God loved the world. He gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life." So belief is essential, and Jesus emphasizes the belief. In Acts chapter 16, verse 31, Paul and Silas are in prison, and the jailer asks them, "What must I do to be saved?" And they respond, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, along with everyone in your household." Then in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8 and 9, the Apostle Paul is speaking, and this is where we see the debate between James and Paul. Because Paul says, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourself, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." So we see it's faith, it's belief. Those are the foundational pieces in order to actually be saved by Jesus. Now, James is emphasizing works, good deeds, actions. But we do have to be careful not to call James somebody who emphasizes works righteousness, that you can earn your salvation. Because in chapter 1, verse 17 and 18 of James, he talks about how salvation is a gift from God, that we are the first fruits of creation, that we are the ones that are saved because of the gift that God has given us. Now, at the same point, Paul also talks about judgment and how we'll be judged according to our actions. He says in Romans chapter 2, we're judged according to our works. In Romans chapter 14, all will give an account of ourselves and our actions to God. And in 1 Corinthians 3, he says we will receive a reward according to our labor. So I want to emphasize the fact that there is both and. So we have the historic debate between James is talking about the actions and our good works, and Paul is talking about faith and the belief side of things. We have to have both in order to actually have evidence of the faith that we claim to have. See, because faith moves us to value others. I think that's one of the fundamental things sometimes we gloss over. That if I believe in Jesus and I believe he has saved me and he has transformed me and moved me, what it does is it helps me value other people. So as I go through life, I'm not going through life selfish, because there's something greater. Jesus has changed me and has given me the opportunity for something different than what the world offers. So I don't view you as something that can advance my agenda. I view you as someone who Jesus Christ died for. So it shifts our mentality. But we do recognize what we value, we make time for. I mean, think about it. If there's things in life we have to say, well, I can do this or I can do this. And the thing that we value the most is what we actually do. Sometimes that means we have to do things we don't really like to do. Well, I like to have the heat on in my house, so I go to work so I can pay the electric company, right? So I value having a comfortable temperature in my house. You know, from another practical standpoint, you can look at parents and see how they value their kids. If parents value their kids, they show up for them. You know, it's not always exciting to go to this thing or that event, but parents, if they value their children, show their support in various ways. And so we see in our world, whether believers of Jesus or not, what we value, we make time for. And so James is writing about the dangers and detriment of profession of faith without practice. And in James' mind, dead faith is latent, active faith, or living faith is active. Because he uses the example of somebody who doesn't have food or clothes and says, well, stay warm and well fed. Well-wishing, that's all it is, wishful thinking. We can't do everything. It's not one of those things where you can fill every need that ever existed and ever will exist. But sometimes I think we see all the needs and we say, well, I can't do everything, so I'm just not going to do anything. Part of the message of Jesus Christ is that we work together. That's one of the core reasons the church exists, is to go impact the world with the love and message of Jesus Christ. You impact the world, I impact the world, and we see change. Not just because I do one act, but because we all work together to impact the world. Now, James and Paul have some different ways they use some of the words that they do. See, James defines faith as an intellectual affirmation. Well, I believe Jesus existed. Well, secular historians believe that Jesus was an actual person. Most of them do. And so the fact that we believe that Jesus existed isn't anything that changes our life. See, Paul, on the other hand, defines belief as something that moves you to act, something that causes you to change your behavior. Now, Paul would define works or good deeds as legalism and following a list of rules. If you remember, Paul was a religious leader who persecuted Christians before he knew Jesus. So Paul rejects that lifestyle of all of these rules that he grew up in and was a professional clergyman doing these things. And he rejected those. And actually, then Jesus' mission for Paul, once he came to faith, was go preach to those who aren't of the Jewish faith, who don't have any idea of what these rules are. So Paul is sent to an audience that is so contrary to the legalism that he grew up in. Well, James defines works as evidence of faith. See, and there's some give and take that we have to recognize with the definitions and how they work together and intertwine. But James makes it clear that belief is not noteworthy. Belief that doesn't change you, because he uses the demon example. You know, Satan knows Jesus exists. Satan knows God exists, yet they are trying to do things contrary to who God is. Good deeds, works, actions done with the right heart shows evidence of faith. Faith and works are two sides of the same coin. Now, I read from an Ephesians passage earlier, Ephesians 2:8-9, where Apostle Paul talks about it's grace through faith that we are saved. Then in verse 10, right after that, he says, for we are God's masterpiece. He's created us anew in Christ Jesus so we can do the good things planned for us long ago. So what Paul's saying, you can't earn your salvation, but yet God has specific things in store for you to do. You're not just to sit on your hands. You're not supposed to be a couch potato. You're supposed to be out there active and doing the things that Jesus has called you to do to impact the world with his love and his message. So let me give you an example that I came across of things that we believe versus things that actually move us. And it's a mathematical example, and some of you may have bad flashbacks from this one, but I remember in high school, we would use this formula called the Pythagorean theorem. And what that is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So if you have a right-angled triangle, a triangle with one of the angles is 90 degrees, the longest side, the hypotenuse, if you take the square of that number, and then you take the square of the other two sides and add them together, you get the same as the hypotenuse. So let me give you an example. If the hypotenuse is 5 inches, then that means the other two sides, one is 3 and one is 4. 3 squared is 9, 4 squared is 16. 9 plus 16 is 25. 5 squared is 25. And so you see, that is the formula that gets it where it's supposed to be. Now, I've never actually done any research to verify that is actually true. I just remember sitting in math class, hearing that formula, knowing that is what I was going to have to do in order to complete the assignment and get good grades on the test. And so I said, great, whatever. So I learned the formula. So I do believe that it is actually true. But the Pythagorean theorem has not impacted my life. It has not changed what I do and how I live my life. Now, I'm not trying to downgrade math. You know, some of you say, well, math is dumb and it's never going to apply to my life. Let's not do too crazy. That's not my point. There's benefit and discipline in learning math, but use another math example. I know that 10 plus 10 is 20. All right, pretty simple stuff. We learned that very young age, 10 plus 10 equals 20. And I believe that is true, and that actually impacts my actions. Because if I go to a restaurant and I order 2 pizzas that are $10 each, I'm not going to pay more than $20 for those pizzas. That has an impact on how I live my life. I'm not going to go and pay $22 for those pizzas or $25 for those pizzas. I'm going to pay $20. It impacts me, it moves me, it directs my decisions. But James gives a couple examples of people in the Old Testament who are shown to be right with God because of what they do. One of them was Abraham, who was shown to be right with God by his actions when he offered Isaac on the altar. His faith and his actions worked together. His actions made his faith complete. The scriptures say Abraham believed God, and God counted him as righteous because of his faith. He was even called a friend of God. So you see, we are shown to be right with God by what we do, not by faith alone. Now, Abraham is one of those people that both the Old and the New Testament revere tremendously. A great example of faith and foundation, and just has a lot of good things to say about us. And James is quoting from Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, where it says, and Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. It's quoting, that's what the Old Testament says, and the New Testament affirms that as well. You see, faith, the faith that Abraham had, it made him hear God, but this faith also moved him to act, moved him to follow God into obedience with God. It did both. Hearing and doing were both essential for Abraham's faith. And as I said, the New Testament reveres Abraham, and we have several instances, 7 or 8 different books that actually talk about how Abraham's faith impacts or should impact and inform our faith today. But the reference that James gives is about Abraham offering Isaac on the altar is from Genesis chapter 22. And if you remember the story, God had made a covenant with Abraham that he was going to make him great, give him descendants more numerous than the sand on the seashore. But he didn't have any kids, and him and his wife Sarah were past childbearing age, but miraculously God gave them Isaac. And it was such a blessing to them and such an encouragement to Abraham. Then a little later, God called Abraham to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. And so they went, in a whole long story, but Abraham offered Isaac on the altar and was getting ready to actually kill him, and the angel of the Lord stopped him. So Abraham put his faith into action. God gave this promise, said that I will make you a great nation, but God said you got to sacrifice your son. And Abraham did it, and he was faithful to God. And he shows us that dead faith is latent, living faith is active. Now, don't get me wrong, Abraham wasn't perfect. There were things about Abraham that weren't necessarily ideal, but James is speaking from a practical standpoint. He's not talking about the doctrine of salvation that these theological scholars have. He's talking about how it's lived out and the average ordinary person. The person who's trying to seek Jesus in their workplace, in their finances, in their homes, wherever they are. James is talking about how can we do this in all circumstances. And Abraham shows us that we need to be willing to sacrifice all that we have. And James highlights the fact that he's a friend of God. A friend of God means that he is not a friend of the world. And it's real easy to become a friend of the world without realizing it. What it does is it places our possessions, our personal security and safety, our future ahead of anything else. And so we say, God will sacrifice for you as long as I can still do this, as long as I can still cover the bills, as long as my retirement is still intact, as long as my health is okay. Lord, I can't do those things. You know, there's many people I've heard of, and if I'm honest, I've had a mentality like this before. Said, Jesus, I'll serve you, just don't call me to be a missionary somewhere. Right? We don't want to sacrifice that much. I'm real comfortable where I am, and I'll serve you here, but don't send me over to that country, or don't take me away from my family. You know, that's the mentality sometimes we have. But we need to have active faith. We need to have living faith. We need to have faith that moves us. Because Abraham's actions showed his faith. His actions and his faith didn't compete with each other. They actually completed each other. Now we have to be careful. Good works are not a substitution for faith. There are people throughout history who've tried to do all these good things in order to earn their salvation, and James is not giving us permission to do this. He's saying that good works verify our faith. That the good deeds that Jesus has called us to do show that we actually legitimately believe in Him. Our faith is revealed through those actions. What should happen is that when we're doing the good works that Jesus has called us to do, that other people will see us and say, what's with that person? There's something different there, and they may not know it, but they're curious and they want to know more. That's what James is getting at. We should be moving to do things that draw people to Jesus. Not just say we believe, but having our actions inform, or our actions be informed by our beliefs. But James gives another example from he talks about Rahab the prostitute. She was shown to be right with God by her actions when she hid those messengers and sent them safely away by a different road. Just as the body is dead without breath, so also faith is dead without works. Now this reference is from Joshua chapter 2 that James is using, and it's Rahab. She lived in the town of Jericho. The Israelites were getting ready to enter the promised land. And as they did, Jericho was the first city that they needed to overtake. And so they sent some spies to check out the city and see what they needed to do. And Rahab harbored the spies. She protected them, and she allowed them to get away safely so that they could get back to their camp. What had happened is Rahab had heard of what God had done through the Israelites. The miracles that God provided and how He took care of them and how His power was shown. And so she saw that and she said, I want some of that. Not in a way that she just wanted God's power, but in a way that she saw who God was and say, I want to follow that guy. I want to follow that God. I want to be a follower of who God is. And so she rejected her upbringing, the ways that she was living, and turn towards God. Now, Rahab is about as opposite of Abraham as you can possibly get. One of the most obvious examples is Abraham, the man, Rahab's a woman. But Rahab was a prostitute. That's not something that screams righteousness in our world or their world. But she was also somewhat outside of the lineage of Abraham. Abraham was the person God established a covenant with, and it was his family that was going to raise up and be a great nation. Rahab was outside of that. She was an outsider. But see, God connects with both. Just the insider and the outsider can both be shown to be right with God when they believe in Jesus and have their actions informed by that belief. The shown to be right or justified words that James used is a little different than what Paul might use, because Paul uses them as an acquittal, like you're found to be not guilty. James, on the other hand, uses them as more of a vindication or proof of righteousness. That you are shown to be right means that your actions show that you are no longer a sinner, that you are no longer contrary to Jesus, but you are following him. It's not just not guilty, it's more than that. See, not guilty is kind of the first step. But now James is talking about now you're proving your innocence, not because of who you are, but because of Jesus in you. See, we need faith and we need deeds. We need both of those in order to legitimately be a follower of Jesus. Now, this is one of those things that I think what happens is, we know this. We've heard this many times before. Or maybe it's just too cliche. We're here, the battle between works and faith. And we kind of zone out or whatever that necessarily means. But what I have found to be true is that it's real easy to sit back and say, oh, somebody else will do it. But the purpose of what God has called us to do is not just so we do things just so something gets done. See, when Paul talks about God has created us, these works in advance for us to do, he knows your passions. He knows your gifts. And what God says is just let me use those. See, we don't have to do things that just drain us. Now, sometimes we've got to be disciplined adults. We've got to do what God has called us to do. But for the most part, when we follow our passions and allow God to use those passions, that's when real change happens. That's when people are drawn to who Jesus is. People aren't drawn to Jesus when you begrudgingly do something. People are drawn to Jesus when you're excited about it, when you're energized by it, when it's fun. And when our passions are used for Jesus, it's fun. Whatever your passions are. For some reason, I was thinking some of you may be involved in a fantasy football league. I haven't played since I was 11, and I have no interest to play anymore. So for me to join a fantasy football league to win others for Jesus is probably not effective. In fact, my number one draft pick that year was Bubba Brister. Most of you probably have no idea who that is. That's how bad I was. Now, on a side note, because of injuries and how things happened, I ended up picking up Kurt Warner that year when he broke out and had his MVP season. Praise be to God. So, but the fact of the matter is, use our passions for Jesus. Allow him in there so that who we are is driven by who Jesus is. Now, the best example I've heard about how faith and actions work together comes from an illustration that my pastor, Gary Richardson, gave growing up. He was talking about, he was mowing his yard, and he said he was walking along, mowing his yard behind his mower, walking, and all of a sudden he felt a pain in his foot. He walked, ow. Not a terrible pain, not something that was excruciating that made you moan and groan and fall on the ground, but something that was just painful and a little sharper, and got a little sharper. Every step he took, a little sharper. What had happened is that a rock had gotten into his shoe. And so he was walking along, mowing. You know, he could have continued mowing and just dealt with the pain. But he also knew that if he stopped, took his shoe off, and removed the rock, that the rock would stop causing pain in his shoe. But just because he knew that, Just because he knew removing the rock from his shoe would stop the pain doesn't mean it mattered. Only when he actually put his knowledge into action did it have an impact in his life. That's what we're called to do. Just because we know what we're supposed to do doesn't mean it actually matters until we do it. That's what James is getting at. You believe in Jesus, wonderful. Let Jesus shape your life. Stop. Do something so that Jesus can be in your life. People can see him through you, and your passions will be seen as things that bring people to Jesus.